Hello, namaste, welcome, good afternoon, everybody. I bow in reverence and gratitude to those of you joining me in the room, to those of you joining me on Zoom, and to those of you listening to the recording afterward. Welcome to Living from the Heart, a Dharma talk about this extraordinary journey of 18 inches from the head to the heart, a journey of one moment and many lifetimes. I start with a poem of my own as a lead in to this week's topic. We'll close out with a short meditation to integrate what we've talked about. The topic for this week is on knowing who you are and being who you are. And today's poem is called Bringer of Light. I can't tell you who you are. If I did, I'd be wrong. If I tried, you wouldn't believe a word. Even a mirror cannot show a tree to the seed. It is even more useless in the dark. The eyelids are gifts for the eyes, the same way the floating moon plays a tune that makes the wise weep. What is most unseen is most obvious. The center is everywhere. When you find it, life will explode in its radiance. So, what does it mean to know who you are? The Tibetan Book of the Dead begins with this famous line: O nobly born, O you of glorious origins, remember your radiant true nature, the essence of mind. Trust it, return to it. It is home. There is so much profundity in these simple lines. Remember your true radiant nature implies that you have forgotten who you truly are, and you must remember that you are radiating, that your true nature is one of beauty and light. You have forgotten who you are. We all have forgotten who we are. Humanity is caught up in a grand amnesia where we have forgotten our true radiant nature. There's a story of a man who goes to the DMV to renew his license, and the clerk there asks the man to identify himself. So he pulls out a mirror, looks at himself in the mirror, and says, "Yep, that's me." And this is how we are most of the time. What we identify with is simply what is on the surface. This is our ego self. Our ego is simply who we think we are. I sometimes call the ego self the resume self or the driver's license self. It is a list of information about who we are, but information that lies in words and barely touches the surface of all that we truly are. Our driver's license self, our resume self, our ego self is a series of descriptions with our name, our address, our phone number, and our past history, different places we have lived in our life, different things that we have done with our life, the day that we were born. All of this is simply information, information for the mind to think that is who we are, but information does not encapsulate the depth of our being. And I was just reading a book about careers and finding a new career. And it was saying that half of people go through an identity crisis when they lose a job. This is what happens when we identify as what we do. If we are no longer able to do what we do, then we have a loss of ego self and a loss of identity. Perhaps it's when we lose our job and we no longer feel that we can identify as this job that we were doing. For many parents, there is a loss of identity when the kids move out of the house and suddenly there is no longer anybody to parent. So we think we are the information that describes us, and we think we are what we do. When we no longer can do what we do, we have a loss of identity and we don't know who we are. And this loss of identity is fertile ground, fertile earth to begin our spiritual growth, to begin our spiritual path. Pretty much every tradition, spiritual, religious tradition around the world can all agree. Our first step is to know who we are, and who we are will not be found outside of ourselves. It is not to be found in the external world. It is not to be found in any psychology textbook or even any spiritual text. No textbook will be able to tell you the mysteries of your own psyche. Nothing in outer space will ever be able to tell you about your inner space. Sri Ramana Maharshi says this: just drop all seeking, turn your attention inward, and sacrifice your mind to the one self radiating in the heart of your very being. For this to be your own presently lived experience, self inquiry is the one direct and immediate way. St. Augustine says this: do not go outside yourself, but turn back within. Truth dwells in the inner man. If you find your nature given to frequent change, go beyond yourself. Move on then to that source where the light of reason itself receives the light. And finally, Lao Tzu says this: he who knows others is wise. He who knows himself is enlightened. So I often like to note that all philosophical inquiry, all spiritual and religious inquiry begins with a questioning and unease about the human condition. Part of being human, it seems, is to suffer. The first noble truth that life contains suffering. Fundamentally, we aren't happy with the way things are. And in this level of unhappiness, we seek to find a larger meaning to our life. We seek to find answers to many of the questions that we find ourselves asking about life. We ask ourselves, who am I? And in this question of who we are, we have to inquire about the nature of birth and death. Hence the Zen koan, who were you before your parents were born? Hence the great inquiry in all religious traditions, what happens after we die? But we have other questions like who or what is God? What is our relationship to God? What is God's relationship to us? And what does the universe have to play in this relationship? So when we have these deep questions, these potentially unanswerable questions, we find that philosophical, spiritual, and religious inquiry will approach these questions in a few distinct ways. The first approach is to simply answer these questions. And many people like this approach. They like to have a fundamental sense of certainty about the world. God created the universe. God created man in his image. And our task in this life is a bit of a test that we pass or fail, and that will decide our role in the afterlife. And when we think about what does it mean to be a good person, well, we have 10 commandments. to tell us exactly how to act. And we are given fundamentally an afterlife to cope with death after this current life. So, this is a very popular path, and for good reason. It's nice to have ground to stand on. It's nice to have a certain level of certainty and understanding. And this certainty and understanding turns into a bit of faith that things are right to be exactly as they are. But there are other ways to work with these questions. And if we shift a little bit more towards the East, we find a couple different approaches. The first one is to essentially question the questioner. Who is it that wants to know so bad? And why do you want to know so badly? There's a story of a young student who goes to his Zen master and asks the master, "What happens after we die?" And the master says, "I don't know." To which the student, somewhat aghast, says, "But I thought you were a Zen master, enlightened to the true nature of reality." And the teacher goes, "I am a Zen master, but not a dead one." And as you know, in these teacher-student stories, the teacher is telling this particular student exactly what they need to hear, which is essentially let go. Your anxieties and fears about the future are about the future. The future is an illusion. Therefore, your fears and anxiety about the future are also an illusion. And this was Jiddu or J. Krishnamurti's biggest rhetorical technique. When people would ask him a question, he would simply reply, "Who's asking? Who is it that wants to know?" Essentially, encouraging the questioner to take that U-turn and that inward step about what is so wrong about this world that we need to fix it to get an answer to our questions in order to feel a sense of peace in this moment. There's a story. I love this story where one day God decided he was going to open up his kingdom to all human beings on the earth for a big question and answer. For one day and one day only, God would ask whatever questions people had of him. So, big day. Obviously, many people were lined up for this day. And people ask questions. You imagine most people would ask, "Hey, I lost my wedding ring 3 years ago. Where did I lose it? Hey, how tall is this mountain next to me in the exact dimensions?" As we imagine God as some omniscient and all-knowing entity, we often want to figure out the great stats of life, right? How many opportunities did I miss? What if I had done this decision differently? How would my life have turned out? And as people continue to ask their questions, a rather smart person thought he'd ask God a bit of a tricky question. And when this person came to the front of the line, they asked God, "Well, what question should I ask you?" And God loved this question. And he said, "You should ask, is there anything in this world that goes beyond positive and negative?" Quite the inquiry. So that person turned around and whispered into the next person's ear, "This is what you should ask God." So the next questioner asks, "Well, God, is there anything in this world that goes beyond positive or negative?" And God replied, "Who's asking? Who wants to know?" So there's a certain level of insight we can gain from this somewhat silly story. The first is an inquiry into the duality of nature and the duality of the mind. Is there anything in this life that goes beyond positive and negative? So when we think about getting answers to our fundamental questions about life, we have to really inquire, what makes you think that you could even know? What makes you think that your mind could possibly understand all the mysteries of the universe? Because fundamentally, your mind is dual. It only knows things by comparison. It only knows what one thing is as a way to differentiate between all the other things in the universe. As the saying goes, everything is either a potato or not a potato. In other words, anytime we say something exists, we are inherently creating a duality of non-existence. And this is how our mind works. It can only know things in relation to other things. It can only know yin in relation to yang, only know birth in relation to death, only know north in relation to south, left to right, up to down, subject to object. Although the mind does a really good job at convincing us that this is one way to understand reality, we have to realize there are limits to what we can possibly know. So when we think about good and evil, light and dark, we have to recognize that these concepts are interdependent. You cannot have one without the other. If I ask God to take the whole universe and move it 5 meters to the right, that doesn't make any sense unless the universe is moving relative to something. This is how the mind works. So, in asking and finding this inquiry of, is there anything in this life that goes beyond positive and negative, birth and death, up and down, joy and sorrow, praise and blame? We are looking to see if there is a reality that goes beyond what the mind could possibly comprehend. So, when a person asks, is there any aspect that goes beyond duality? God answers, who wants to know? Who is asking? If you are suffering so much, inquire within. Who is the one that suffers? Who is asking these questions? When you use the word I, who or what exactly are you referring to? Another story for you. A traveler knocks on the door of a renowned Sufi master. When a person opens the door, the traveler says, I'm looking for Hassan al-Basri. Have you seen him? To which Hassan replies, I'm looking for him too. And for 20 years, I haven't been able to find him. So, this is a lovely investigation into our inner experience. Is there anything static and fixed to our experience? When we think of ourselves as the ego self, the resume self, we have to consider, is there any aspect of this that is fixed? We so easily identify with our thoughts, ideas, beliefs, and emotions. But as time goes on, we notice how all of these things change, even on a minute by minute basis. We can just sit here in meditation and be so angry at what somebody said earlier in the day. And then a minute goes by and we suddenly think about somebody that we love, and suddenly we have an overwhelming sense of joy. 1 minute anger, the next minute joy. Neither of these aspects are lasting in our inner experience. So, this path of questioning the questioner is essentially the gyana path, the path of knowledge. Of the 4 paths of yoga from Swami Vivekananda, we have bhakti, the path of devotion, karma, the path of action, raja, the path of self discipline and mastery, and gyana, the path of knowledge, the path of knowing who you are. And the entire text known as the Upanishads is this exact inquiry. Upanishads literally means to sit near, implying that you would sit near your teacher, and through some extensive discourse and questioning, your teacher will help you bring your mind to a level of enlightenment and awakening through this questioning and inquiry of who you are. And a wonderful way to explore that is asking if there's any fixed and lasting aspects to your experience. So this gyana path, this path of knowledge or knowing, this path of gnosis, is essentially using the mind to go beyond the mind. So Ramakrishna used the metaphor of using a thorn to remove a thorn that is in your skin. We can use the mind to go beyond the mind. We can use the path of knowledge to go beyond the limits of our knowledge. But what do we do once we use a thorn to remove a thorn in our skin? We toss both thorns away. So eventually we let go of any conceptual thinking, beliefs, ideas, and assumption, the full extinction of all of these things. So that's a lovely path, this method of inquiry, seeing if there's anything that goes beyond your body, sense, mind complex. But there's a third way to work with these questions. And this is to stop the questioning altogether. Your questioning essentially is a symptom, and we have to find the cause. The problem is not in the world. The problem is in your own mind. This world is already perfect. There's nothing wrong. There's no serious inquiry to be made. It's your mind that is troubled and trying to figure out this great mystery, which will never be fully understood by your limited brain in your limited head. So even William Shakespeare in Hamlet says, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So remember, the mind is dual. It divides up this world into good and bad. But what is the world? It just is. And this is a very, very, very hard pill to swallow for many people. This basic idea that this world is perfect as it is. Because how could you possibly look at the horrors, the catastrophe, the sufferings in the world and see these things as perfect? How could you possibly look at the war and genocide that human beings do to one another? How could you possibly look at childhood cancer and people living very short and brutish lives as ideal, as perfect? And that is a wonderful inquiry to go down, to really get into the nature of suffering, the nature of birth and death. There's a famous story of the Zen master, Dahui Zongao. And in Japanese tradition, when a person is nearing the end of their life, they are supposed to write a death poem. So Dahui Zongao was near the end of his life and he didn't yet have a death poem. And all of his students were like, you can't die without your death poem. You must write your poem now. And Dahui said, okay, I will. And then he took his pen and paper and he wrote this: birth is thus, death is thus, verse or no verse, what's the fuss? So, what's the fuss about this drama that us human beings find ourselves in? And again, you might think, well, when I go to those pearly gates and when I have the opportunity to ask God any question I want, this is exactly what I want him to explain and exactly what I want him to justify. Why did you let these horrors happen in the world? Were you just asleep during the Holocaust? But the yogic path is simple. It says this: just calm your mind and all will be revealed. Tame and calm your mind in such a way that it ceases to ask any questions at all, because it is resting in a much deeper knowing. This is the lesson of the yogic path, that underneath all of this conditioning, there is an unconditioned self. And we lose touch. We forget this unconditioned self. And when we are stressed, when we are at unease, when we are suffering, when we are reacting out of anger, hatred, ill will, and frustration, we are essentially unconscious. We are asleep. We are caught up in a trance, caught up in a dream. But if we can wake up from this dream, if we can remain still and find a calm mind, an inner wisdom, and eternal peace will naturally arise. All you have to do is release all your attachments to beliefs, assumptions, ideas, and every other conceptual thinking. A Zen story for you. Long ago, there was a famous hunter by the name of Sekio. One day, while out in the mountains, he happened to pass Basho. Basho stopped him and asked, "As you are a master hunter, how many deer can you kill with one arrow?" And Sekio answered, "No matter how good a hunter is, with one arrow he can only kill one deer at a time." Basho then said, "You are well known as a master hunter, but one doesn't have to be a master hunter to kill one deer at a time with one arrow. With one arrow, you should be able to kill a whole herd." Just as Sekio turned to glare at Basho, Sekio attained great enlightenment. So Basho knew exactly what to say to Sekio for him to release all conceptual understanding about the world. Your idea of deer is just a concept. If you are stuck in conceptual thinking, of course, only one arrow can kill one deer at one time. But it's the mind that creates the separation. It's the mind that creates the concept of deer. So we can kill all deer, which is a metaphor for the concepts we have of the deer, with the stroke of insight. And that stroke of insight is enlightenment. So, Sutra 1.3 from Patanjali says this: Tada drashtu svarupe avastanam, which can be translated as, then the seer rests in their own true nature. As you know, we've talked about it before. Sutra 1.2, yoga is the calming of the mind. And that gets us to 1.3. Once your mind is calm, the seer, the one who sees, rests in their own true nature. How wonderful is that? Zen Master Dogen says this: "You should therefore cease from practice based on intellectual understanding, pursuing words and following after speech, and learn the backward step that turns your light inwardly to illuminate yourself. Body and mind of themselves will drop away, and your original face will be manifest." Another story for you. Once upon a time, there was a great king of the Kuru kingdom named Yudhishthira. There are many stories of Yudhishthira in the Mahabharata. In this story, it goes, once a beautiful crane flew down next to king and asked, "What is the news of the world?" To this question, Yudhishthira did not reply with news about the economic situation or the latest natural disaster, which is what most news broadcasts today are filled with. Instead, Yudhishthira replied, "All living beings have forgotten their inner divine nature and find themselves in a state of ignorance or avidya, which causes them to suffer." The next question was, "What is the greatest wonder?" Again, Yudhishthira didn't answer the obvious, like the pyramids of Egypt or the Taj Mahal. Instead, he replied, "Although we see around us that all people and other living creatures are constantly dying, we believe that this will not happen to us. We think that somehow we will escape death. The third question was, what is the true path? Yudhishthira answered, the true path lies in following the saints and yogis who have achieved self-realization. The truth lies hidden in the caves of their hearts, and they will share their knowledge and grace with anyone who cares to receive it. By associating with those great teachers who have no egocentric attachments and live only to give, we will emulate those qualities. And for this last question, the crane asked, who is happy in this world? To this, Yudhishthira answered, the self-realized person who has cleared all of his depths by resolving all of his or her karma is truly happy. And in this story, the crane revealed himself as Yama, the god of death. This was all a test to see if Yudhishthira was worthy. Such beautiful questions, such beautiful inquiry. We have three lessons from this story. One, we have forgotten our true divine nature. Now we are ignorant. Ignosis. We don't know. We have avidya, not knowledge. We don't know who we are. In the Surangama Sutra, a classic Mahayana Buddhist text, it goes, the human mind possesses the Buddha nature. It can be compared to a man who has a jewel in his clothes he knows not of, or to a man who seeks after food when he has a treasure in his own storehouse. So our true nature is good. This is such a key part of the path. It would be a bit of a sad state of affairs if we finally calmed the mind and our own neurotic tendencies to find inherent evil at the core of our being. But we find the exact opposite. We find our Buddha nature, our Christ consciousness, Krishna consciousness. We find a center that is fundamentally good, peaceful, loving, and joyful. So the lesson from this story is on this path of discovery, we find there's nothing fixed about our experience, that this body and mind won't last. We think death won't come to us because there is a permanent state to our being, but we have to recognize we will discard this body and mind eventually. So your task in this life is to begin that search of discovery for something larger, something lasting, and this puts us on the path. And finally, we find joy, happiness, and love. And that is our true nature, friends. That is who we are. We are boundless. We are infinite. We are Satchit Ananda. Ananda. We are blissful. Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj knew this, and he taught his students. When the mind is kept away from its preoccupations, it becomes quiet. If you do not disturb this quiet and stay in it, you will find that it is permeated with a light and a love you have never known, and yet you recognize it at once as your own true nature. I have to say that again. If you do not disturb this quiet and stay in it, you find that it is permeated with a light and a love you have never known, yet you recognize it at once as your own nature. So we have to recognize the limits of the mind. Whenever I teach anatomy, I tend to begin with the inquiry. I ask my students, is there a single human being on this planet that fully comprehends a single blade of grass? And to which my students have to come to that conclusion that no, the mind is limited. We are not omniscient. Even if you have a PhD in grass studies and have spent all of your life studying the species of grass, you don't fully know. You don't know every chemical and enzyme and biomechanism in a single blade of grass. What makes us think that our mind can know who we are? So, another common way of going beyond the mind is recognizing its limits, that just as fire won't burn itself, a knife can't cut itself. You cannot touch the tip of your finger with the tip of said finger. You can't know who you are using the mind because you are the knower. Another story for you, friends. Two monks were washing their bowls in the river when they noticed a scorpion that was drowning. One monk immediately scooped it up and set it upon the bank. In the process, he was stung. He went back to washing his bowl, and again the scorpion fell in. The monk saved the scorpion and was again stung. The other monk asked him, "Friend, why do you continue to save the scorpion when you know it is its nature to sting?" "Because," the monk replied, "to save it is my nature." That is your nature, friends. Our nature is love. Our nature is to care, to tend to this world. Our nature is not to be found in the mind, but to be found in the heart. So, believe it or not, even on the Eastern path, we are told to have faith. First of all, in order to begin any endeavor, you must have some faith that it's going to work out. Why would you follow directions to a certain place if you didn't believe that the directions would take you to that place? So we absolutely have some faith in this method. Why else would we be doing all these crazy and insane breathing exercises and physical exercises and sitting in a room and watching our breath for hours at a time if we didn't believe and have faith that this method was going to work? And you can also have faith in your own basic goodness. And we can ask ourselves, do we believe in a fundamental goodness and a secret inner beauty that lies within the heart of every human being? We can ask ourselves, is this universe a friendly place? Are human beings essentially good? And the spiritual texts give us a resounding yes. We all have an inherent goodness, a fundamental goodness. If you do see somebody doing what you consider to be bad things in the world and creating suffering in other human beings, it is the conditioned self, the ego self, that is doing those things. It is not the essential goodness. We can bring out that goodness and be mirrors to each other, reflecting back the goodness that we are. And we have to recognize this huge tendency that we have to judge others and make others bad. In seeking to make our ego self good, one way we do that is by elevating ourselves above others. Another story for you. A woman calls the police and says that her neighbors are always sunbathing naked in their yard. She says it's obscene and it needs to stop. When the police get there, they notice an 8-foot fence dividing the two houses and mentions that to the old woman, to which she replies, "Well, of course you can't see them from here, but if you go into the attic and stand on a stool and look outside the window, then you can see them plain as day." And this is how so many people operate, and we can notice these tendencies within ourselves and the establishment of our ego self. We seek to be better than others. We seek to create unreal others to make a real self. And these concepts are interdependent. But we can have a healthy self-esteem and a healthy understanding of self by dropping out of the ego self that seeks to elevate it above others and instead find a connection and kinship with all human beings. So our nature, our true nature is in the heart. The mind is limited. It cannot fully encapsulate or know who you are, but guess what can? The heart. The heart can, because it contains everything, even the divine. The Sufis have a saying, neither heaven nor earth can contain God, except for the heart of the servant. The heart of the servant contains the divine, my friends. Your heart contains this whole world. It's that big. You have this inherent goodness that can hold it all. That's what it says in the Radiance Sutras. There is a place in the heart where everything meets. Go there if you want to find yourself. Mind, senses, soul, eternity are all there. Are you there? Enter the bowl of vastness that is the heart. Once you know the way, the nature of attention will call you to return again and again and to be saturated with knowing. I belong here. I'm at home here. So, this is what it means to know who you are and to be who you are. Let go of thoughts you have about yourself and rest in a deeper knowing and wisdom. Calm the mind, and your true nature will manifest. Your original face will manifest. And this original face is good. It is loving and joyful and at peace all at the same time. It encapsulates it all, the positive and the negative, the good and the bad, the good people and the bad people, recognizing that we're all just people. So it is that sense of homeness, recognizing everyone as our brothers and sisters, recognizing this earth is our home, this heart is our home, and it contains it all. This is what it means to know who you are and be who you are, that you can be loving and joyful and true because that is who you are. That is your lasting, true nature. So let's sit together, friends, resting in that deeper knowing, resting in the heart space. Take a deep inhale, and like a wind that blows away all things, exhale out all ideas, concepts, assumptions, and beliefs. Calm the mind and rest in your true nature, the nature of the heart space. Oh, nobly born, O you of glorious origins, remember your true radiant nature. Trust it, return to it. It is home. Let us each be mirrors to the other, reflecting back the inherent goodness that we are. And may we see that inherent goodness, that secret beauty, that divine in others. And we have our final word to encapsulate this knowing, to encapsulate this recognition of the divine in the other. Namaste.